Philip Ingram is a retired British Army colonel. He was a senior British Army intelligence officer. Welcome to our program, Colonel Ingram.
Nice to be on again. Thank you very much indeed.
North Korea has deployed 50,000 troops to the Kursk region, including the Russian troops and North Korean one, aiming to launch another full-scale attack on the Ukrainian army, also to liberate the Kursk region and to even move deep inside the Russian territory, inside the Ukrainian territory in case of success. Meanwhile, Ukrainian political leadership could be eliminated, according to the former Foreign Affairs Minister of Ukraine. This has been reported by The Economist. What is your take on the current developments in the war in Ukraine?
Well, I think it's very interesting. The introduction of North Korean troops to fight alongside the Russian troops shows just how much difficulty the Russians are having in recruiting Russians to go and fight on the front lines. Trying to integrate North Koreans, even if you had practiced and exercised with them for many years, would be very difficult given the language barriers and the issues that there are with different tactics and everything else. And therefore, that's why I think they're going to be used first and foremost in the Kursk region to try and see if they can be properly integrated. But I think it is showing desperation by the Russians.
The Washington Post reported about the phone call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. According to the Washington Post, Donald Trump reminded Putin about the significant military presence of the US troops in Europe and asked Putin not to escalate in this war. However, Kremlin denies the fact of this phone call between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. What is your opinion about this?
I find this very, very interesting indeed. And I think, as many of your viewers will know, they'll understand Russian psychology and Russian intelligence psychology behind this. And I think that's critical to understanding what's happened. I suspect there has been a phone call, whether it was directly between President Trump and Vladimir Putin or between those that are working for them. That is not clear, but I suspect what has happened is that Trump's team, as we're seeing, not just with what was reported in his effectively threat to Vladimir Putin, but we're seeing this out of Trump's team in threatening Hamas and other organizations around the world, suggesting that as soon as Trump becomes the 47th president and gets sworn in, then he's going to start to take decisive action. He is saying, his team is saying the same thing to President Zelensky, prepare to negotiate. Otherwise, we're going to cut all your support off. But it was interesting, the Russian response to deny the phone call ever happened. And that came out of Peskov, who is the biggest source of disinformation coming out of Moscow, and is usually the disinformation voice that is put out there whenever he wants the world to think it's serious. And then what happens immediately afterwards, we find that Russian state television starts to broadcast naked pictures of Melania Trump, Donald Trump's wife, whenever she was a model, and puts that all over Russian national television. That, to me, when I'm thinking of it from an intelligence officer's perspective and thinking of it from a Russian intelligence officer's perspective, is a pure threat back from Putin, back to Trump. And that is Putin, I think, saying to Donald Trump, just be careful what you threaten me of, because I may or may not have something that I can embarrass you or threaten you with. And that's, I think, the message that he was sending back again. So, there was definitely some form of phone call, whether it was directly Trump to Putin, probably not, but certainly between their two staffs. And therefore, Peskov denying it, I think he's very carefully denying that there wasn't direct conversation between Putin and Trump, but then the threat came back in. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. I think Donald Trump's threat to the Russians not to escalate, I don't think Vladimir Putin's going to listen. And therefore, when it comes to, even if Donald Trump's new presidency starts off by trying to force some form of peace negotiations, I don't think the Russians are going to give any ground whatsoever. And therefore, if President Zelensky plays his diplomacy card as well as he has done in the last almost 3 years, then he will allow Vladimir Putin to make all of the mistakes. And therefore, I suspect Donald Trump might come in and use the veiled threat that he has done and allow Ukraine to hit Russia very, very hard several times to force them back to the negotiating table. It will be a very interesting time.
Do you think that Vladimir Putin perceived this kindly reminder from Trump about the military presence in Europe as a threat? That's why he could done this threat. He could do this threat in exchange of threats between Putin and Donald Trump. Do you think that Putin felt himself as a humiliated one after this phone call or exchange of messages between Trump and Putin?
Oh, I have no doubt Putin felt humiliated. I have no doubt that Putin and his team will have done everything to try and ensure that Donald Trump got into the White House. But he didn't have to put much effort in because the Democrats were so bad that they did all the work that was needed for him. But I think Putin, because of the tacit support that there has been and some interesting meetings between him and Donald Trump in the past, probably feels as if he's got some form of relationship there, whether it is a one that he feels he's got some form of control over or not is difficult to assess. But he will have seen or will have taken the wording that the US has got a lot of capability in Europe as a direct threat. And if that was in the opening statements of a new phone call, even if it was between staffs, that will have concerned him. And that's why I think Putin's response was to put naked pictures of Melania Trump all over Russian state television to threaten him back again, because that's what Putin does. But to do it in that way, to make it personal, to use Donald Trump's wife is not just a Russian way of doing things, it's a Russian intelligence way of doing things.
It seems like an ugly action from Kremlin, don't you think so?
Oh, very much so. But have we seen anything else out of the Kremlin but ugly action? They've ignored in their war with Ukraine, it's not a special military operation, it's a war, but they have ignored the rules of war. They're a permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations. They're not living up to being on that position on the world stage. They are one of the biggest pariahs in the world at the moment. There are international arrest warrants out for Vladimir Putin and many of those in his regime. This is something that even when the war ends, the implications of what has gone on are not going to end for a long, long time.
From your perspective, do you believe that Donald Trump can reach a ceasefire in Ukraine in the nearest future? The Telegraph reported about the plan, which consists of deployment European, British troops to the front line in Ukraine to ensure the demilitarized zone along the front line between Ukrainian troops and Russian one. Do you believe in such scenario?
Well, it was reported as coming out of Donald Trump's team as part of the planning. I think they've been planning for lots of different scenarios. I don't think they talked to the British about this, and I don't think they've talked to other NATO nations formally about this. But the one thing you can guarantee is the only way that this conflict is going to end is by negotiation. War is diplomacy by other means. And war will only finish whenever you go back to proper diplomacy and can sit down and talk. However, the conditions need to be right for the talking to happen. And those conditions, from my perspective, and from, I see, President Zelensky's perspective, are not Russia continuing to hold Ukrainian territory. And if somehow or other that was a forced solution, to my mind, I think that that would potentially stimulate a much larger global conflict, because we've got other despot leaders such as Xi Jinping in China sitting watching to see what will happen. And if Vladimir Putin has got the ability to forcibly take territory that is not his and to keep that territory, and the international community turns a blind eye and lets him do that, as happened with his initial illegal invasion in Crimea in 2014, then Xi Jinping will turn around and work out whether it is worth the international wrath for him to physically capture Taiwan by force. And if he decides to capture Taiwan by force, the Japanese, I think, will try and retake their Kuril Islands that Russia has occupied since 1945 back again, because Russia will be at its weakest. And if that happens, then Kim Jong-un in North Korea may turn around and think that with the world occupied in dealing with what's going on in Taiwan and potentially Japan, and cleaning up with what is happening between a forced peace deal in Russia and Ukraine and what is going on in the Middle East, then that's his best opportunity to try and capture South Korea. And we could see a nuclear weapon being dropped on Seoul. And therefore, the stakes, the global stakes for getting this wrong are huge. And I've been at this game for over 40 years now, looking at global threats. And I've never seen such a clear path to a third world war as I can do now.
But why would Vladimir Putin agree to a ceasefire in Ukraine on any kind of terms if his troops were moving forward on the east of Ukraine?
Yeah. Well, I think his troops are moving forward, but at a huge cost. In the last 24 hours, I think, according to the Ukrainian Minister of Defense, he lost 1,950 troops dead or severely wounded. That is unsustainable. He has been losing over 1,500 troops a day through the whole of 2024. And you can measure its unsustainability not by looking at Russian statistics or listening to the comments that are coming out of the Kremlin, but looking at the fact that he's having to actively recruit in Africa, and he's having to actively try and get Kim Jong-un in North Korea to supply troops. And he's just signed a formal defense agreement with Kim Jong-un in North Korea to open the gates to get even more troops. But it's not just the troops that he's short of, it's also vehicles, ammunition, and other weapon systems. And again, he's relying on North Korea to supply him lots of ammunition and weapons. He's relying on China to provide him the technologies. And China is hesitant at doing it because it doesn't want to bring in the wrath of the West if it's seen to overtly supply capability. But the price that Vladimir Putin will be paying for China's tacit support will be enormous. China will be expecting to be given ownership of huge areas of Russia's natural resources, and that will cause diplomatic pressures further down the line. And of course, we've got Russia relying on Iran as well. And from a global perspective, we have to ask, what are North Korea and what are Iran getting from Russia by way of payment and support for what they're giving into Russia? So I don't think Russia has got the ability to sustain the operations it's doing at the moment for any length of time whatsoever. And I think if they're still doing this by early to mid 2025, then they will have just about run out of new manpower and run out of equipment, even the equipment that they're bringing out of storage and elsewhere. So the tide will turn very, very quickly indeed if Russia continues with these losses into next year.
Don't you think that Trump would need to put more pressure on Vladimir Putin to force him to negotiate in good faith, to make some concessions to Ukraine? Because previously Putin said that he would not make any kind of concessions, and the war could be ended only on Russian terms. And all we know, you and me, all we know, what are these Russian terms?
Well, the Russian terms are difficult. I think they've changed. I don't think Putin knows them himself at the moment. It was the complete capitulation of Ukraine with the installation of a puppet government like we see with Lukashenko in Belarus, and therefore Ukraine becoming pro-Russian and moving away from Europe and moving away from NATO. That's never going to happen. So now his changed objective will be the retention of Crimea and the captured territories, or ideally the whole of the disputed Donbass region. As Putin puts it out as disputed, it's not disputed. The international boundaries are very clear. But that's what Putin will be hoping for. Donald Trump will have to put a lot of pressure on Putin, and we will see in the initial weeks and months how much of a hold Putin has over Trump by the statements that Trump is coming out and the additional pressure that he then puts onto President Zelensky. If there's any move towards an unfair settlement in any way, shape, or form. But I don't think Putin's going to capitulate. And therefore, Trump will be expecting him to give up something. But Putin's not of the mind to do that. And Putin, I think, is so isolated in his own little cell of people who want to tell him what he wants to hear, and therefore still believes that he is in overall control and can influence things. I think he will just dig his heels in, as we say in the UK, and will not give any ground whatsoever. And that will force Trump's hand to potentially dump his relationship with Putin, if he has one, or what he's trying to do from a fair perspective, and to back President Zelensky with some very real military capability. I think when we get to negotiation, a demilitarized zone is an ideal end at the end of the conflict, but that demilitarized zone should not necessarily be a demilitarized area of territory that Russia occupies inside Ukraine. That demilitarized zone should be inside Russia, within artillery range and rocket range of the Ukrainian borders. And I'm sure the Ukrainian military would quite happily, if there's an international peacekeeping force, turn around and agree to a demilitarized zone along the Russian border, provided there was a proper peace agreement in place with proper troops that were there, making sure that it was being kept secure.
Do you expect a big confrontation, escalation between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin? As you said, Vladimir Putin would not be ready to any kind of concessions to Ukraine, the United States, because he will just dig in and move forward with his war objectives. And on the other hand, we have Donald Trump, who would try to force Putin to get him to a negotiation table. But if Vladimir Putin refuses to any kind of a normal, appropriate peace deal, would it mean a big confrontation between Trump and Putin?
I can see that coming. I can see it building up. What will happen is there will be increasing tension behind closed doors that we won't see from an international community's perspective. We'll know that tension is building by the statements that are coming out after people are become aware of Putin's meetings and discussions with Vladimir Putin. We will know the level of control that Putin has or thinks he has over Trump by the statements that will come out of Moscow and from Peskov, but also by the way Trump's behavior may change. But at some stage, that relationship will have to come out into a public environment where I think if Putin will not give any concessions whatsoever, and I don't think he will, then Donald Trump will have to get very angry with him very publicly, and there will be a complete breakdown of relations. Again, that is worrying because Vladimir Putin may turn around and think that the only way out of this would be to start a wider European war or to stimulate conflict going on elsewhere. So he's got a degree of control over Kim Jong-un in North Korea. He might stimulate Kim Jong-un to do something that would take America's focus away elsewhere, which is why I think European nations are getting very worried, because we have three regions of conflict brewing around the world, in Europe with Russia and Ukraine, in the Middle East, and in Southeast Asia. From a global perspective, the most current of biggest threat is Russia in Ukraine and what Russia would do next. But from a longer term perspective, the worst conflict would be a conflict growing in Southeast Asia, because that would have an even bigger impact across the globe. The United States is concerned that the world is trying to expect it to deal with all three regions simultaneously, which is why I think Trump will put an awful lot of pressure onto Europe, onto the European nations within NATO, to try and provide even more support to Ukraine than they're doing at the moment.
Also, we have another developments about the national security team of Donald Trump. So Mike Waltz would becomes the next national security advisor to the Donald Trump. Also, I have read his latest article on the Economist, and he wrote, I will quote, "If Vladimir Putin refuses to talk, Washington can provide more weapons to Ukraine with fewer restrictions on their use, and faces with this pressure, Vladimir Putin will probably take the opportunity to wind the conflict down," according to the latest article of Mike Waltz. Do you agree with this strategy, with this presumption?
I think it's a clear indication of what I've been saying so far. Mike Waltz is, on one hand issuing a big threat, on the other hand, suggesting a solution. And whenever you're in diplomatic negotiations, you never leave yourself in a position where you're not giving the other side a way out, a way of doing things. So Mike Waltz has very cleverly told Vladimir Putin what to do. If Putin doesn't do it, he said what will happen. Now, we'll see that more and more as Donald Trump's team starts to settle in and prepare to take over the White House. And then once the inauguration has happened, I think we'll see this coming in very quickly indeed. Of course, we've seen exactly the same tactics come out of his new Secretary of State, where he was talking about the situation in the Middle East, where he turned around to Hamas and threatened them and said, release the hostages and release the hostages now. If they're not released by the time Donald Trump becomes the 47th president, then we will take our the gloves off even more. So we're seeing this threatening behavior happening in each of the conflicts around the world. That will keep Xi Jinping worried, so he will not do anything to impact Taiwan in the near future. But I think, on balance, if I was Vladimir Putin and thinking logically, which Putin doesn't do, I'd be very worried. If I was President Zelensky, knowing that I know how to be a diplomat on the international stage and to be cooperative and to win people over, I'd be quite happy if he continues to do that. So I don't see Donald Trump coming in as being as bad as people may have predicted.
Does it mean that Donald Trump would be the worst case, the worst president for Vladimir Putin rather than Kamala Harris, for example?
Well, I think Kamala Harris will have continued the policies of Joe Biden, and those policies were heavily influenced by internal domestic U.S. politics, and the real differences there were between the Republican Party and her Democratic Party. We saw that whenever the leader of the House held up the $60+ billion aid package going to Ukraine over a domestic issue with regard to the border in Mexico for almost 6 months. And we saw the impact that that had with the thousands of Ukrainian lives that were lost because of an internal domestic political dispute inside the United States, which was disgusting. Kamala Harris would have continued to do the same. So the one thing I think we'll get out of Donald Trump is greater decisiveness. I think we were scared that that decisiveness would be pro-Putin against Ukraine. I thought that myself initially, especially after Donald Trump left the presidency beforehand and watching him. But I think over the last year or so, I've been looking at it in more detail, and I think, as you say, it could be the other way around. Donald Trump's presidency could be the worst thing that is ever going to happen to Vladimir Putin.
Also, European leaders are trying to work out whether they can keep Ukraine's war effort going if Donald Trump decides to stop sending aid to Ukraine. According to Bloomberg, can European countries really replace American aid for Ukraine, military one?
I don't think European countries can replace US military aid to Ukraine. But what it can do is it can increase its support and give probably just enough to enable Ukraine to continue to defend against Russian aggression. And if European nations actually increase their military production capability, which there's a debate going on, and President Trump may force European nations to do that. We've heard him, or we saw him in his last presidency, put pressure on NATO nations to make sure they were paying a minimum of 2% of their GDP to NATO, to their defense side, to meet their NATO commitment. Many nations weren't doing that, and after he threatened them, many nations got up to that 2%. He may turn around and say 3%, and if he forces European nations to increase their defense budgets, then that would increase the ability of those nations to provide support to Ukraine. So I can see the potential for European support to increase, but can it replace in the short term or medium term? No.
How do you see Donald Trump's stance on NATO? Can he and will he withdraw from NATO from your perspective?
I don't think it'll withdraw from NATO. NATO is a defensive military alliance, but there's also a lot of political kudos that comes from it. And America leads it at the minute. The Supreme Allied Commander is always an American officer, because that gives him influence into Europe, and it gives the United States strong political influence into Europe as well, and allows him to keep his northern border under a bit more control and put pressure on them. Of course, we've got Canada as NATO, and Canada is one of the countries that is not meeting its signed up commitment of 2% of GDP to its defense forces. And I think Donald Trump will put more pressure on them. I think Trump will increase the pressure on NATO countries to increase their defense spending, and will be very blunt and aggressive in doing so. But he approaches things from a businessman's perspective, not from a diplomat's perspective. So he's used to forcing his hand in business and using threats to get what he wants. So we'll see more of that. But I think NATO is pretty secure, because what he would want is NATO to do exactly what it says on the tin, North Atlantic, and to start to look after North Atlantic security, allowing the United States potentially to pivot further into Southeast Asia to look at the growing problems that there are there, and also to try and bring greater stability into the Middle East, because that has got a massive impact on the US economy as well as the global economy.
What would it take for Donald Trump and European leaders to force Vladimir Putin to a negotiations table from a military point of view? What are the most tough options for Donald Trump in case of a big confrontation between Trump and Vladimir Putin, and in case of the political will of Donald Trump to put more pressure on Putin to force him to negotiate with Ukraine and end this war on just terms, at least appropriate terms for Ukraine?
Well, I think the bravest thing that the international community could do to support Ukraine would be, first and foremost, to remove any restrictions on use of any weapons inside Russian territory at all, and to increase the supply of long-range weapons, to enhance the very real capabilities that Ukraine is developing and fielding with the long-range UAVs. It's attacking Russian targets with great success. But if it got longer range Western weapons, that would give Ukraine the ability to disrupt Russian activities that are coming in to support its actions into Ukraine. And the second thing, and I think this would be extremely brave, but it ties in with a lot of discussions that are going on at the moment, would be potentially to move NATO troops into Ukraine to secure the borders with Belarus, to secure the eastern part of Ukraine, to create a secure area for Ukraine's defense industrial base to thrive, secure areas for military capability and military training to go on, and allow the Ukrainian military then to focus purely on pushing Vladimir Putin out from the illegally captured territories in the east of Ukraine. And NATO could potentially provide more of a marine and naval capability for Ukraine to operate as it would then plan operations to retake Crimea. But that would be very brave, because that would be very much throwing the gauntlet down to Vladimir Putin and cross his, more than just his red lines, cross the line of an existential threat to Russia, and that could potentially stimulate the use of nuclear weapons, which is something that NATO countries would be are very concerned about and would be even more concerned about.
According to The Guardian, relations between Ukraine and the United Kingdom have worsened since Labour won the general election, and the big issue of this is authorization to use long-range weapons inside Russia and providing Ukraine with more Storm Shadow missiles. What is your reaction to this?
Well, we saw it when Boris Johnson was the Prime Minister. He turned around, and when the international community was not providing main battle tanks to Ukraine because Vladimir Putin had said that was a red line and he would consider using nuclear weapons, Boris Johnson turned around and provided the first 12 or 14 main battle tanks. The UK can't provide much equipment, but that political move to do that broke the impasse. I think if Boris Johnson was still the Prime Minister, then Storm Shadow, the restrictions on the use of Storm Shadow would have disappeared overnight. Ukraine would be allowed to use them, and Boris Johnson would have turned around to the Americans and gone, "Hey, I've allowed it to be used. There hasn't been a problem. Let's just get on with it." And Francois Macron in France would have agreed with Boris Johnson doing that. The fact that Keir Starmer isn't being as bold politically when it comes to forcing the hand of the rest of the international community, and he doesn't seem to be doing very much apart from just making statements about giving levels of support. That to me suggests that the level of support coming out of the United Kingdom has gone backwards since the new Labour government has come in. They're not making very many decisions, however, in the UK as well. So I don't think this is specifically related to a relationship with Ukraine. I think this is our new Labour government in relationship to everything that they're trying to make decisions on. They're not doing well at the moment from a populist perspective.
Also, Jonathan Powell, Tony Blair's former chief of staff, has been appointed to as a new national security advisor to the UK Prime Minister. Don't you think that this appointment of Jonathan Powell as a national security advisor could be a reason of such weak support for Ukraine, not bold as it was during Boris Johnson's time in the office?
Yeah, it is. And here's where I'm going to make a very personal statement because this is my personal belief. Jonathan Powell in that position is a joke. It is an appallingly bad appointment. Anyone associated with Tony Blair's government being appointed into this government shows that the new government in the UK just does not understand diplomacy. It does not understand the issues that there are within our own country and how to deal with issues from an international perspective. And that can only be a bad thing for Europe, a bad thing for our relationship with Ukraine, a bad thing for our relationship with the United States. The UK is not in a good position at the moment.
And my last question for you would be about the next policy of Donald Trump. What do you expect from Donald Trump regarding his policy towards the Middle East, the war in Gaza, towards the Korean Peninsula, tensions between North and South Korea, and towards the situation regarding Taiwan?
Yeah, well, I think with regard to the Middle East, we've already started to see some of his policy coming out where Senator Rubio, who's going to be his next Secretary of State, has directly threatened Hamas. I think there will be, we'll see statements in the coming days or weeks of direct threats to Iran if they continue to support Hezbollah and other terror organizations across the Middle East. Direct threats into the Houthis as well. So Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel celebrated Donald Trump coming in because he sees him as a friend. And I think all of the Iranian-backed militias operating across the Middle East will be or should be concerned now because Donald Trump, when he was last president, he kept saying that there weren't any wars during his time. There were more UAV strikes, assassinating senior people in different organizations than during any other presidency. And again, we'll see similar tactics down into Southeast Asia. So I can see Donald Trump reaching out a sort of hand of friendship to Kim Jong-un in North Korea and saying, talk and negotiate, give up your support for Russia. And we will help North Korea develop economically. But please don't threaten South Korea. At the same time, he will reach out quite firmly to Xi Jinping and threaten him if he tries to take Taiwan by force. There has never been a good relationship between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. So the United States has got a global issue with Trump coming in that it's having to focus on. So I think that's why we will see him trying to push European nations to provide more support into Ukraine, rather than the US have to take on three different areas of responsibility as the lead for all of them. It would rather only have two and be supporting in the third. And therefore, US support in Europe in the fight that Ukraine has got to push Russia back, I think will stay, but it will dial back whenever European support is raised up. So we're in for an interesting time, I think.
Does it mean that we are closer to the global conflict rather than ever before?
There's a simple answer to that, yes. The uncertainty that Donald Trump brings in makes the world much more unstable. That uncertainty also, in some ways, will make the decisions by the likes of Xi Jinping and all the rest of it push them off. So it'll bring an element of stability. So I'm sort of contradicting myself here slightly, but that's what intelligence officers do, and it's important that we do contradict our own thinking. Whenever Trump gets in, if he goes in for an aggressive stance, we are getting closer and closer and closer to a global conflict. We are at the moment. It's going to need someone of his sort of character, I think, to try and push us away from it, because I think if Kamala Harris had been in, we would slowly have drifted towards a global conflict, and I think it would have been a certainty.
But only this even maybe weaker position, don't you think so?
Oh, very much weaker position. Yes, she was weakening the U.S. military. NATO resolve was being weakened. Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping were continuing to fracture international relations through information operations and operations in the grey zone with their intelligence services, and would have continued to do that until they decided it was a point where the international community had less ability to come together and react to whatever they did. At the same time, we were seeing a strengthening of what people refer to as this axis of evil: Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, and that growing relationship is very worrying indeed.
Thank you, Colonel Ingram, for your time, for your insights and supporting for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Slava Ukraini. Thank you.
Героям слава. Thank you very much.